Continuing this idea of modern institutional discrimination, how it's changed over time. Um, Although the traditional, more overt forms of prejudice and discrimination have disappeared, contemporary forms still exist. They're just a bit more amorphous and indirect. This is very similar to how things were, as you know, in the antebellum South. It was in your face, and prejudice and racism was in your face. And as African Americans moved north, it wasn't as in your face, but it still existed, and it was in the whisperings behind your back, and the refusal for positions and things like that. So this clarity of Jim Crow ultimately yields to the ambiguity of modern institutional discrimination, even though it continues that legacy and that past. Always have to talk about assimilation and pluralism and ultimately acculturation, how it happened at times and didn't happen others. The centuries of cultural domination and separate development have created ultimately a unique Black experience in America. African Americans share language, religion, values, beliefs, and norms of the dominant, but have developed distinct variations on the general themes, mostly due to the fact that they've been excluded. The acculturation process ultimately was slowed and possibly even reversed during the late 1960s and the Black Power movement. Another concept to take in consideration is secondary structural assimilation. This is that residential segregation between blacks and whites, which peaked toward the end of Jim Crow in the 1960s and 1970s and has decreased in recent decades. Residential segregation continues to be the norm, and that blacks are much more segregated from whites than are the other two groups. These patterns also reflect the social class differences between the races and are reinforced by a variety of discriminatory practices, including racial steering, redlining, and white flight. That white flight that I talked about in reference to the donut hole effect in St. Louis, as African Americans rolled into the north, the whites fled the urban centers and moved out to the suburbs. School integration was, of course, one of the most important goals of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, and ultimately was aided by pressure from the courts and the federal government. And in the end, there were considerable strides made towards this goal for several decades. But in recent decades, the pressure from the federal government has eased, and school integration is slowing, and in many areas has even reversed. Overall, Black American political power has tended to increase over the past several decades on the national, state, and local levels. And the number of Black elected officials at all levels of government increased from virtually zero at the turn of the century to almost 9,000 in 2010. This represents a potentially ominous threat to the trend in this growth of restrictions on voting in many states in recent years. So there is a threat. I talked about challenges to the Voting Rights Act, voter ID cards, things along those lines that are doing their best to disenfranchise folks from the vote. Again, most of this is in reference to the rising power of African Americans and Hispanics in local, state, and federal politics. The situation of African American jobs and income has improved since the end of de jure segregation, but to argue that it's equal would be a gross overestimation. We've already talked about African Americans are making about 70 cents on the dollar compared to whites. Unemployment has been at least twice as high for blacks as for whites since the 1940s, with this affecting black males somewhat more than black females. Of course, the differences in education and jobs are reflected in the persistent racial income gap, and poverty affects black Americans at a much higher rate than it does white Americans. Interracial contact in the more public areas of society is certainly more common today, which is great. And this has led to increases in more intimate contacts across racial lines, which helps break down conflict and barriers between the groups. On the other hand, further increases in this area are limited by continuing structural pluralism and separate black and white institutional and organizational structures. There's evidence that the percentage of whites that included African Americans as intimate contacts has increased slightly, which is great. And additionally, the approval of interracial dating and marriage appears to be especially high among younger people. So, as always, we look to the youth to pull our irons out of the fire, or our butts out of the fire, if you will. And that leads us to the election of Barack Obama. Some say, oh my goodness, we are now past race. We elected an African American, or we actually elected a person of mixed heritage to the highest level of office. We, of course, now understand that Donald Trump is the President of the United States, and that the idea of race being a non-factor is a bit naive. So Barack Obama, of course, took the oath of office, and became the 44th president of the United States. As I said, is this a post-racial society? Of course not. And honestly, I mean, what would a post-racial society be? Well, it would be it would mean anti-black prejudice, racism, and discrimination have lost their force. Well, that's not the case. Diminishing power of racial identity in American society. Once again, not the case. And empty rhetoric, or a mistaken and greatly exaggerated interpretation of the significance of Obama's victory. So that was the case, that society just kind of lost its mind for a second and said, oh my goodness, this is an event. An event that, of course, is going to lay to rest our problems with race in the United States. Well, we had 8 years of breaking down barriers and growth in reference to social diversity in the United States, and unfortunately now we're seeing the pushback of that. So some conclusions to take away from the election of Barack Obama. Which of the versions of the interpretation for post-racial seems most viable in light of the information presented here? Of course, the truth is perhaps a mixture. While race may be losing some of its historic power to shape our perception and control our lives, our society continues to be deeply divided by race. And as climate change starts to set in, and I know I haven't talked much about climate change in this class, it's a class on race and ethnicity, but as climate change continues to set in, And we see more and more demographic upheaval. So there'll be places where it's just not going to be as easy to live in, and that can lead to the deterioration, destabilization of societies. And then all of a sudden you have refugees and people on the move. And as more and more people become on the move, these issues of race and ethnicity are going to continue to plague us. They're going to make it harder for us to continue along this path uh, of building a diverse society. So in the end, is the glass half empty or is it half full? I always like to think my glass is half full, but perhaps the most reasonable approach is to recognize that in many ways, the overall picture of racial progress is just different. It's not necessarily better, it's just different. And that a large percentage of African Americans have traded rural peasantry for urban poverty, and they face an array of formidable and deep-rooted problems. Problems that are structural in nature. They're not the fault of this population. They're the fault of the structure of society, and in many respects, just the one of the basic tenets of that structure, which is dominant minority relationships. Urban poverty, modern institutional discrimination, and modern racism are, of course, less dramatic and more difficult to measure than when we look at the overseer's whip, or we see the footage of a lynch mob, or we watch film clips of whites only signs in the 1960s. But do not make the mistake to think they are not just as real and don't have just as deadly consequences as the more overt forms of racism, prejudice, and discrimination from the past.